Good morning from Nashville, Tennessee. I'm Hal Humphreys. This is the monthly webinar for PI Education and Pursuit Magazine. I'm Hal Humphreys, your host. Remember, we say this every time. We have to say it every time. I'm not an attorney. In this setting, we're not acting as attorneys. We are sharing advice, sharing tips and tricks, sharing what little wisdom we have to share in the hopes that we can all be better investigators. We are not providing legal advice. So if you have a question that requires some legal advice, call your attorney. Do not rely on us. If you're new to the room and you've never been to one of our webinars before, click on the bottom of the screen there. There's a little button that says subscribe. Go ahead and click on that. Subscribe now. It doesn't cost you a thing, and it helps us to have more subscribers. This month, the month of November, is what's traditionally known as Fraud Month, and this week in specific is International Fraud Week. And that does not mean it's a free pass to go out there and commit fraud. It means we as investigators, we as certified fraud examiners, study fraud and talk about fraud and try to get the word out about fraud and its potential dangers. To that end, we have a very special guest with us today, David Weber, who I had the chance to speak with a couple of weeks ago. Super intelligent guy, super funny guy, engaging, not what you would expect from a clinical assistant professor of accounting at the Purdue School of Business at Salisbury University. He is an engaging character. David is a certified fraud examiner, registered private investigator, and licensed attorney. He completed more than 2 decades of public service. In 2013 as Assistant Inspector General for investigations at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC Chief Investigator. He now teaches full-time at Salisbury's Fraud and Forensic Accounting Certificate Program and leads a boutique law firm with an expertise in fraud examination and forensic consulting. David, that is quite the mouthful of an introduction, and I'm not sure that I got my mouth around all the words quite as well as I would have liked to have, but welcome and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here for International Fraud Awareness Week. I think that a lot of people know this is the 20th anniversary of Fraud Awareness Week. So it's an appropriate time to be talking about fraud in the middle of the pandemic. So I am a full-time professor here at the Purdue School of Business of Salisbury University. Salisbury is one of the University System of Maryland state universities and is, thankfully for me, the university that has the fraud and forensic accounting program for the University of Maryland system. So that's why I'm here. It's also 29 miles from my beach house, which is the second reason I'm here. Although I'm wearing a fleece today because it's a little chilly. I retired from my public service as the Assistant Inspector General for Investigations, or what we in the IG community call the AIGI, in 2013. Before that, I was the Section Chief of Enforcement Unit 1 at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Before that, I was the Special Counsel for Enforcement for the Department of the Treasury. And I have some skills in the fraud field. I'm a forensic accountant by training and also a lawyer, but I am an accounting professor, so I'm teaching accounting, not law. But I am licensed here in Maryland and in Virginia and in Washington D.C. and in my hometown, New York. So I really appreciate you having me here. And as you mentioned, I'm a licensed private investigator, which is what my interest in PI education is.
Well, we're tickled to have you here, and you know, fraud is a topic that I have really kind of gotten my head into over the years. I enjoy working on fraud cases as a private investigator. I know a lot of investigators are kind of reticent to dive into the world of fraud investigations, especially the ones that come from a more surveillance-oriented background. Ones that are used to doing that kind of work sometimes are a little bit timid about getting into the fraud examination world. But here's the thing. I mean, my background is kind of in financial due diligence, but I'm not an accountant. So when I look at fraud, I kind of look at the big picture issues of fraud. I know there are forensic accountants out there that dive into the nitty gritty of doing Benford tests on spreadsheets and all that kind of stuff. But there's more to fraud investigation than just going through numbers. A lot of times the fraud is proved by old school gumshoe work of interviewing witnesses and making connections between people that you didn't see before. Any thoughts on that, David?
Well, there's no question that getting off your ass and knocking on doors is the way to, solve fraud cases. And one of the certifications that I'll just share with the listenership that some may not be aware of, and I think your one as well, is a certification called Certified Fraud Examiner. And a certified fraud examiner is basically a professional investigator with some financial training skills. But the core competency of a certified fraud examiner is the ability to not only look at numbers and look at paper, but conduct interviews of witnesses, conduct interviews of the suspects in an attempt to obtain an admission from the suspect. It is also in preparing the reports and making conclusions. So there is a lot of the skill set of the professional investigator that fits right into investigating fraud. And even, using a more common example, when you use surveillance as an example, even using surveillance, if you're working on a marital infidelity case, there are other ways to prove marital infidelity other than, videoing a hotel room. Looking at those bank records or credit card statements can be very effective at proving that somebody's not where they're supposed to be, like in a hotel room that they charged to their credit card.
Who'd you buy that diamond ring for?
We at the SEC used to call the SEC the Sexually Explicit Commission. And the reason that we called it that was a significant amount of the investigations that were conducted by the Office of Inspector General were of misconduct by U.S. government employees. And one of the more frequent acts of misconduct, the two most frequent, were watching porn on government computers, which has nothing to do with what I'm about to say. But the second was there was a lot of marital infidelity, and people would use their government credit card rather than their personal card because those statements would not go to the spouse. But the Inspector General had free access to them. So I don't know if any of them actually bought diamond rings for each other, but there was definitely a lot of nookie going on.
Yeah.
Not involving me. I mean, I don't know. Everybody else was having it, but not me.
The funny thing is, Ryan, I can't remember his last name. He's a certified fraud examiner out of Louisiana. And he wrote an article about all investigations lead to porn. And one of the things that they use, I think he's with the state agency down in Louisiana. He said one of the things they do is they look for porn usage on government computers. And a lot of times, as they're going through the fraud examination, they'll find evidence of porn on the government computer. So, yeah, Sexually Explicit Commission.
We had to have one special computer at the SEC where we could look at the porn because there were web blockers on all the government computers. After we wrote enough management alerts and enough investigative reports, management started to restrict certain IP addresses, and some of the off-the-shelf products that they bought to prevent the porn were more effective than others. But the only way we could then look at it to see what the employees were doing is we had to have one computer that didn't have the software on it, so we could look at what they were looking at.
Interesting. Well, moving on from porn, because we'll have to have another episode on porn altogether.
You guys don't have a porn month here on PI Education?
I think we could get a lot of clicks if we did that. You did an article for Pursuit magazine called "What Every Professional Investigator Needs to Know About Fraud in 2020," and it's about occupational fraud and white collar crime, kind of an overview. Briefly, let's discuss kind of what 2020 looks like in terms of fraud, and then I'd like to get into the fraud triangle and some of the theories of fraud, but just kind of give us a broad brush description of 2020 and fraud in the financial world.
All right. Well, first of all, in terms of 2020 fraud, one of the things that we've been seeing, I'm going to say over the last decade, is the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, conducts research, and every year has what's called the Report to the Nations on Occupational Fraud and Abuse. And that is statistically valid research that is done of the membership made up of certified fraud examiners to learn what's going on. And so one of the trends that I think we finally have reached, the highest level of, is that many people thought that with an increase in technology, there would be a reduction in fraud. But in fact, it's the opposite. Okay. The increase in technology has dramatically increased fraud. Okay. And of course, the reason that we're finally at the precipice this year is because now most people and their occupations, they're working online. So the fraud has reached a point where absolutely technology has increased the opportunity for fraud. Okay, we're in the past, let's just use, we're going to talk about pandemic fraud in a minute, but in the past, if you wanted to commit bank fraud, not bank robbery, bank fraud, you'd have to go into a local bank branch of your community bank and you'd have to apply for a loan and you'd have to give them a personal financial statement. Well, today you could apply for 30 loans or 400 loans or 6,000 loans, and you can do it at the click of your keyboard. Okay? Yeah, technology is what's enabling that.
Yeah.
Okay. Technology could also combat that.
Sure.
But unfortunately, as we're talking about, particularly when we get to the fraud triangle, controls have not necessarily kept up with the technology.
Yeah.
So that's the first. Go ahead.
No, that's one of the things that I want to get into is like the notion of, I think a lot of businesses are realizing, and I know we have in Storyboard, the company that runs PI Education and Pursuit Magazine, we have realized that, we don't actually have to have everybody in an office in order to maintain this business because we're all working on tech-based issues. So, during the time of COVID, Kim and I have been working out of the house just to limit the number of people in the office.
And that's your house behind you, right?
That is a high-tech green screen device. Yeah, let me turn it that way so it looks even cooler without the wood panel there. So yeah, we've set up a studio here in the back room of the house, and we do most of our work here. Now I go into the office, once a day, early in the morning to have a meeting with my business partner and kind of keep track of what's going on. But everybody else is working from home, which is great. And we've realized, at this point, I think we can, other than the studio that we use for a lot of our education business, there's really no need for everybody to be in the office. And I've heard a lot of people from a lot of different industries make that realization that it's just not necessary to be in the office around people all the time. Now, some people want to be there. Some people thrive in that situation, but it's not necessary. Now, for us in this business, number one, it's a really small business. So it's not that hard to keep track of what everybody's doing. But if you're working in a bigger industry, I'm thinking of banking, people that are working from home, it can be difficult to keep track of what, Jill Williams is doing throughout the day, or, Casey Stanford is doing throughout the day.
Professors too.
Yeah, but my take has always been, I really don't care what Jill does throughout the day. I don't care what Stephanie does throughout the day. What I care about is the results and the product and, getting things done. But some businesses work on a different process. But the bottom line is, we've all kind of dispersed to our homes to do our work. And somewhere along the way, I'm going to say March, April, everybody forgot about controls. And I think that's probably a really good segue into the fraud triangle. And I'm going to put you on the spot and say, what is the fraud triangle?
So the fraud triangle is a theory, a hypothesis that was first articulated by two PhD professors like myself by the name of Cressy and Sutherland. They were both associated with Indiana University. So for any of my doctoral colleagues that are out there, They know what we're chuckling about because we have a notorious professor that was our professor who came from the same university, came from Indiana. And we haven't asked whether he actually knew them or was old enough to know them, but he is a notorious professor in my own doctoral career. These guys came up with a theory that for fraud to happen, there had to be three things. The first thing that there had to be was an unshareable financial need. So under this concept of an unshareable financial need, you had to have some type of reason that you needed money. I mean, it's almost always money. So that could be a family emergency, a foreclosure, a job, an illness. Using 2020 as an example, plainly a pandemic fits for unshareable financial need. The second thing that you need to have rationalization. So you have to have a suspect who is willing to explain why he or she is doing what they're doing, even though they know that they shouldn't be doing it. And then the portion that probably is the greatest cause of fraud, and it's what you started talking about, is that there has to be opportunity. And opportunity means that you could have a scumbag suspect who has the rationalization, has the pressure, has an addiction, has whatever, but if the opportunity isn't there, it ain't going to happen. And so that opportunity is poor oversight, is not having appropriate restrictions on access, is having system loopholes. So in the accounting world that I come from, we call that internal controls.
Sure.
And so what you just mentioned, and we were talking offline, and in the magazine we have a Q&A with the U.S. Small Business Administration Inspector General, Hannibal Ware, who was gracious enough to do a Q&A with us. He also came and visited with my fraud students last night, live in class. I mean, he came virtually through Zoom. But one of the things that we were talking about is this constant tension between having the appropriate internal controls and doing what the operational tempo requires. And so the challenge with the controls in the pandemic is that people are desperate. People need money. That's the whole purpose of these pandemic programs. At the end of the day, it's to throw a lifeline to people so they can pay for their health insurance, keep employees on payroll, keep the lights on in small business, and keep America, rolling. But at the same time, that pressure to get the money out the door means that there has to be a balancing act between imposing the appropriate internal controls and getting the money out the door. I think in hindsight, and obviously 2020 is always hindsight, but in hindsight, because we've now got $1 trillion out the door in a lot of these matters, a very significant amount of that money is fraud. I mean, very significant, in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
And I want to go back to, like, I want to kind of break down the fraud triangle in kind of small slices. So the notion of pressure, we think of that unshareable financial burden, or that unshareable burden. And typically that falls into the category of, someone is an addict, someone is a gambling addict or something like that. They've got a porn addiction, whatever, and they've spent too much money and they've got to cover it up. They've got to hide it from their family and friends, right? I think one of the things about this current business of COVID fraud and the relief funds fraud, and this falls into pressure as well as rationalization. We all know the pressure of, I don't say we all, a lot of people know the pressure of trying to feed their family, of trying to pay the bills, of being late on this or that, right? We think that's not an unshareable financial burden, but there's an ego component that makes that really difficult. You can't just say, I'm having a hard time, right? Even some of my friends who have taken PPP money because they needed it will still say in public, our business is going great, we're doing fine. Everything. There's this ego element that provides pressure that I think we need to recognize and understand. The other part of it is, and with COVID specifically is the rationalization piece. So for Enron, the overwhelming rationalization was everybody else is doing it. That's the way everybody in the office does it. This is how it's done. That's the rationalization. In this case, the rationalization is, I really don't care. I got to feed my babies. I got to make my home, mortgage payment. The rationalization is, I have to do what I have to do to take care of mine.
But not just what I have to do to take care of mine, but also that my family needs it more than the next guy.
Yes.
Okay. So, or gal. So it's not, I agree that one of the unusual issues, so it's probably more on the rationalization category than on the pressure category, is that I think for a lot of people, everybody's under pressure right now.
Yeah.
So the rationalization is that something in the person, they feel that they're more entitled to it than other people, or that everybody else is doing it. So I definitely know, I mean, without question, because I saw it, and I'm sure all of you saw it.
I mean, everybody saw it in the form of toilet paper.
Well, that's a great example. Did you really need to have all that toilet paper? And the answer, of course, is no. I don't think that toilet paper manufacturing at the beginning really was slow yet, because we hadn't had work from home yet. So yeah, it was just panic buying. And not just toilet paper. I mean, think there's a lot of things right now: ammunition, guns, toilet paper, bicycles. You can't find a bike in most. I'm going to make a bad admission here. I was just in a Walmart. Well, some people would say it's a bad admission. I was in a Walmart. But anyway, I was in Walmart. They actually had bikes, and I was shocked. And,
oh, wow.
And my teenagers were shocked because they were with me. But like the bike store, like real bike stores, nobody's got any bikes because everybody wants to be outside. Now that I'm a professor here on the Eastern Shore, I want a boat because every Jewish lawyer needs a boat. And every Jewish lawyer from New York City needs a boat. Let's make it even more specific. And you can't buy a boat right now. I mean, because everybody wants to do recreation activities.
Right. And it's a safe place to be outside.
But using a boat, I hear a boat is that you're happy with a boat two times: when you buy it and when you sell it. Right.
Sure.
So boats cost a lot of money. I happen to know, as a fact, from having been a federal investigator, that fraud is sometimes committed to get toys. And lots of the articles that are out there now in terms of charging documents are talking about Lambos, they're talking about Ferraris, and they're talking about boats. And that is a rationalization. I need a boat.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We're pushing right up against the middle of the hour. We got about 7 minutes till we get to the middle of the hour. I want to take some time and really kind of dig into the fraud triangle and why it's important. And I've got a story, an anecdote from my personal experience that I think illustrates it pretty well. We had a fraud case that I worked on several years ago that involved a real estate appraiser who had been charged with civilly sued for committing appraisal fraud. And the plaintiff said that, there was somebody had written Rush on the order form, and they said that was code for make the number. Long story short, we were able to show that, using the fraud triangle, the appraiser who was being sued, number one, had a stellar reputation, civic organizations, those kind of things, and not an overspender, lives within his means, well respected, all that business. His book of business was evenly spaced out among a bunch of different clients, to the degree that no single client, including the one that was involved in this, made up more than 3% of his book of work. He had an internal review process inside of his office that was articulated in a company manual and practiced every time somebody finished an appraisal. It had to be reviewed by somebody else in the office. He knew full well that when he turned his reports in to his client, that they had a review appraisal staff that would go through that report with a fine-tooth comb and come back with questions. And he also knew that, once that report is submitted, it is subject to review by the state regulators, federal regulators, all that business. So from the opportunity standpoint, there's virtually no opportunity to commit fraud in the appraisal process for him. From the pressure standpoint, we're able to show that, this client did not make up a big portion of his book of work. There was no pressure from anyone to make, he was not, addicted to drugs or anything like that. And once you relieve those two parts of the triangle, the rationalization is not necessary, right? But the plaintiff in this case, husband and wife, very gainfully employed, built their dream home or bought their dream home, paid, right at the top of the market for it. And shortly thereafter, wife goes back into rehab for like the third time. Wife and husband get into a, horrible, acrimonious divorce. And all this is going on after the appraisal took part, right? Then 2008 hits and they realize, wait a minute, we can, everybody's pointing fingers at appraisers. So let's do that. So they sued this appraiser. So their pressure was, she had addictions and they were going through a divorce. They had extended themselves, and including, not only did she have an addiction to go to rehab, she lost her job in the process. So their income was cut in half. So pressure was substantial. Opportunity was there because everybody was pointing fingers at appraisers saying they're bad people. They're out there, defrauding the public, blah, blah, blah. And their rationalization was, why not? We made some bad decisions, so let's move on with it. But by being able to point all of those things out in front of a judge and jury, using the fraud triangle to illustrate it, it made it very clear to the judge and the jury, oh, we see where the fraud is.
Right.
So I think the fraud triangle is a really useful tool in illustrating those things for investigators.
It absolutely is, but it's not just useful at the court level. It's useful at the front end of the investigation too, because it helps you identify who the suspects are.
Yeah.
So, if you have, if you either are brought in on a retainer or you are a company employed investigator and you have an inventory theft case, for example, you absolutely want to use the fraud triangle to try to figure out who your likely suspects are. So, in a situation like that, the unshareable pressure is clearly what you want to look for. Another example, I use this all the time in class, and I know that I have former students who are now themselves successful investigators listening to this. I used to always talk about the fact that you could simply walk the parking lot of your employer, and that could be a very good source of determining who ought to be a suspect. So, for example, the examples I would give, obviously, because I was in the IG world, were government employees, but obviously using the SEC as an example, Securities and Exchange Commission employees had all kinds of non-public information that could then be traded upon in the markets. And so one of the things that was very useful to do was just walk the parking lot. So, if you have people that are making X, but they're living a lifestyle of Y, you have to ask yourself why that might be.
The parking lot stroll version of a lifestyle audit.
Yeah, but but this is the most visual way. Now, some people who understand how we work can be much better at avoiding attention. Okay, but I would posit that most fraudsters are not as smart as they think they are.
No, almost never.
And just as you put it, that image or the need to show that level of success leads to clothing, expenses, purchases, vehicles, homes, boats that are not modest in nature.
Right.
But I will point out that the best fraudsters are actually very good at keeping it low key. And I'll give an example of that. Robert Hansen, the probably the most damaging KGB and Russian spy that we ever had, who was a supervisory FBI agent, who was in charge of foreign counterintelligence, but he was the spy. He drove a Ford Taurus to work. His wife drove a Dodge Caravan. But he was getting millions of dollars in diamonds in a bag left in a park in Fairfax underneath the bridge. So, but he understood, because he attended training like this, that he probably ought to not drive that Mercedes-Benz into FBI headquarters. And so he didn't. So in his case, he gave the Benz to his stripper girlfriend. Because that way it didn't have to be driven into the Hoover building.
There's always a stripper girlfriend somewhere.
There's always a stripper girl. Well, or a stripper boy, I guess. I mean, it doesn't, listen, we live in an equal and valid world right now. So I'm sure that there are stripper boyfriends in part of the fraud triangle too.
No doubt. We are right at the 12 o'clock hour here in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm Hal Humphreys. I'm your host. This is the PI Education Monthly Webinar. We're talking about fraud today with David Weber, crazy smart attorney, professor, investigator at Salisbury University. David, thank you for being here. Thanks for agreeing to do this with us. We enjoyed the chats. Let's dive right into COVID relief fraud trends, and kind of what it means and what people are doing. How are they getting? What kind of frauds are they perpetrating?
All right, so I'm going to follow, because it's fresh on my mind. And for those of you listening and watching, stay tuned, because our COVID pandemic article will be up in Pursuit Magazine very shortly. I'm going to put it into 4 categories, with the acknowledgement that fraud is so unusual and specific that sometimes it's hard to categorize fraud, because it's only limited by the smarts of the fraudster. But generally speaking, I think there's 4 types of pandemic fraud that we're seeing, okay? And those are consumer fraud, loan and federal program fraud, Medicaid, Medicare, and health insurance fraud, and what I'm going to call fraud squared. And I'm sure we'll spend time with fraud squared, but fraud squared is fraud within fraud, or a scam within a scam. It's so crazy that there's more than one fraud going on in the same fraud. So, so let's take it. Let's start with consumer, and we'll just go down the list. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Is that all right? All right. So consumer fraud. New data out from the Federal Trade Commission. Most investigators know the FTC is the recipient. They run the warehouse for Americans who complain about fraud. Those tips, complaints, and referrals go to the FTC, and then they're shotgunned out to law enforcement agencies. So the FTC recently put out its most current data at the end of October. So what I'm telling you is about 19, 20 days old. So understand that everything I'm telling you, just increase it by another month, okay? But as of the end of October, FTC had received about 120,000 complaints from U.S. citizens and people that are here appropriately about fraud specific to the pandemic. Okay, the largest amount of that fraud involved, and I don't understand this, and I'm curious if you have a thought. Apparently, the single greatest number of that fraud was travel or vacation scams. I do not understand who in their right mind is vacationing in the middle of the pandemic, because it ain't me. But according to the data, $47.89 million in fraud related to vacation or travel fraud involving the pandemic.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I don't know if it's maybe cancellations or unfair not giving people their refunds back, but that seems like a large number.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
The second largest group is what I think more of us are doing during the pandemic. It's online shopping fraud. Okay, because I'm doing a lot of online shopping right now. So according to the Federal Trade Commission, online shopping scams through last month resulted in approximately $22.62 million in losses. So this is not just like looking for cures or looking for testing. I think this is just straight up internet fraud on eBay, internet fraud, on Amazon Marketplace, all the normal types of frauds we see as investigators, but something about it is COVID related. So maybe it's getting that toilet paper.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of fraud like on Amazon Marketplace where you buy the roll of toilet paper and, there's a picture of the toilet paper on the site, but when you get it, it's really it's like for a dollhouse roll of toilet paper. seriously, like that's, so when you see the picture, so the marketplace seller's like, hey man, it looks exactly like the picture. And they're like, no, man, I want a toilet paper for me, not for my Barbie doll.
Unbelievable.
Okay. The next largest after that was email phishing scams and text scams, which was 23.52 million. Okay.
Let me share the screen real quick. Can you see that?
I thought you weren't going to share the screen. I've got funny ones too, but that's a funny one. So, so with regard to the phishing and the texting scams, I'll give a great example because I've already gotten one. Okay, and probably so have some of you. If you have an iPhone, I have recently gotten an alert that came through the App Store saying that Maryland, the state of Maryland, is now opting into a contact tracing thing, where you can use your phone, and based on any person who's diagnosed with an infection, it would theoretically show whether you had a 15-minute or greater exposure to this person within 6 feet using location and cellular data. Okay. And I just had this come up on my screen the other day. But in addition to having that come up on my screen from the App Store, I already had received one text purporting to be from a contact tracer asking me to click a link.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you click that link, they now have the keys to your kingdom. There's spyware on your phone. Or if you click the link and it's in an email, now they're in Salisbury University's email system or Storyboard Education's email system.
Right.
And that's a really big problem. I mean, we know that contact tracers are calling people, and we know that contact tracers are trying to trace people, and we're getting messages from Apple itself. And I'm assuming we're getting Google Play messages if you're on a Droid. How the hell do you know whether the message is coming for real or not for real?
Right.
And that's where I think a lot of these email and phishing scams are coming from.
Right. One that I've seen, a friend of mine was looking to buy a caravan because they were hoping to do some like socially distanced travel over the summer. You know what I'm saying?
So the van life, they wanted to do van life.
Yeah. So they did a little searching for, a tow behind camper of some kind, and found one that was like crazy cheap. And they went on and talked to I think it was through Facebook Marketplace. And the person was like, yeah, my dad died. This thing has sentimental value, brings back memories. I'm really wanting to get rid of it. So, but they wanted him to go buy eBay gift cards to pay for the thing. At which point he called me and I said, no, don't do that. Do not do that. And then not 2 weeks later, I was looking at side by sides, those little UTVs that you can like Gators or whatever they're called, Rangers, and saw one pop up in my feed that was like just cheap enough that it beat all the others, but just expensive enough that it seemed like it was kind of legit, and got the exact same story and the exact same eBay gift card thing. So I called a detective friend of mine at Nashville Police Department and said, hey, I know you guys are crazy busy and I don't want to bug you, but I'm happy to send you screenshots and emails. And I did, and he accepted them. But that's just another small way that people are trying to defraud people.
Absolutely. And the problem is once you get defrauded, the ability of law enforcement to focus on it in the middle of this environment is tough, man.
Yeah.
It's really tough.
Yeah. What are all right, moving on.
So moving on, the next, which is from a dollar perspective, is, by far the largest, is what I'm calling loan and federal program fraud. And I'm calling it both because obviously some of these programs are not loans. Some of these programs are grants, okay, where they don't have to be paid back, okay? So for example, the SBA, that money, and by the way, what I'm talking about now has been exhausted. So this program doesn't exist anymore, but it did exist. There was a program where, as part of the EIDL program, which is the EIDL, it stands for Economic Injury Disaster Loan,
okay,
which was a pre-existing program. It existed before the pandemic. It would be for things like hurricanes.
Sure.
But Congress funded a very significant amount of money into that program. In fact, based on my notes, and remember, I had the Inspector General for SBA right here at Salisbury yesterday. there was $373 billion put into this program.
Okay.
So under that program, a portion of the loan, so the loan was for fixed interest rates over a 30-year term where it's guaranteed by the United States government. So it was meant for small businesses who needed to keep the lights on. And a very small portion of that, $10,000, was a grant. So you could check the box on the form. And if you checked the box on the form, the first 10 grand would come to you within 3 days, and you would get it and you wouldn't have to pay it back. Even if your larger loan was later rejected for underwriting purposes, you would get to keep the 10,000. And
Okay.
again, this is that tension between, getting the money out the door so people can have health insurance
And controls.
So the money went out the door, and as I understand, a very, 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 very significant portion, like in the double-digit amount, ended up being fraud.
Oh my God.
So we're talking billions of dollars of that was fraud. Okay. And I'm going to give two examples of this that have just been in the papers in the last couple of days. Two extremely well-known large banks, JP Morgan Chase, which is Chase Bank, and Wells Fargo, both have had major scandals where their own employees got the grants. Okay. So some of it maybe could have been legit because it's possible that some of their bank employees might have small businesses on the side.
Sure.
But the vast majority of it, they're people who shouldn't be qualified because they've got a full-time job and they don't have a small business. Their business is being bankers. Their business is being loan officers. And by the way, just in case we're thinking these are all tellers or low-level people, they weren't. Okay. My understanding is that when they did the downloads of the data, that there were people at the director level or above. And by director level, I don't mean board of directors, but I mean director level in terms of being mid to senior management. And they were getting these loans. And those are clearly people that were expected to pay full-time and attention to their day job, which is working full-time for the bank. So there should have been no reason that this money was direct deposited. And a lot of these banks make you, if you're a bank employee, you have to have your checking account at the bank that you're employed at. That's not just for cross-selling. It's for exactly what we're talking about now. It's so that they can surveil them to make sure that there's no lifestyle funkiness going on. Well, in this case, as I understand it, both of the banks did catch it on their own. Okay. But they were not necessarily transparent with their employees with what the problem was. So I understand that at Wells Fargo, a system-wide email did go out to several 100,000 employees where they said, hey, we expect you guys to be ethical and we're not going to tolerate fraud. But they didn't come out and say, we can see the money going into your account. But they did report it, as I understand, to the SBA Office of Inspector General.
Okay.
So when we talk about program fraud, the reason I'm using both words is they're not all loans. Obviously, on the loan side, every time one of these things is applied for and there's a false statement in the application, that's loan fraud. It's loan fraud against the bank because obviously the banks are the ones processing these applications. But in addition, because these are guaranteed loans that are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States, in this case, almost always by the SBA, the real entity on the hook, if the loan goes bad, is not going to be the bank. It's going to be the SBA because on a loan by loan basis, the SBA is going to buy back the non-performing loans. So every one of us that is a professional investigator has seen this. They are going out. People are going out and they're buying Lamborghinis and they're buying houses and they're buying cars. And they're claiming that they need the loan to make payroll.
Right.
And they're getting X number of dollars per employee. And unfortunately, the controls really weren't there to prevent this from happening. Luckily for us, bank fraud has a 10-year statute of limitations. So the government will have plenty of time to come after these guys later and gals.
Yeah. So this is actually a good point to kind of go into a couple of questions we have from the room. John Hagan asks, and this falls into, Wells Fargo reported the SBA, but like, who can I call to report when someone gets COVID relief money in another person's name? So if you know someone is committing COVID relief fraud or you suspect that, who could they reach out to?
So there's two different, and I guess in this case, I don't understand if they wish to take action themselves as a private investigator, or if they're simply trying to get law enforcement involved. If
Right.
they're trying to get law enforcement involved, if we know what type of relief it is, okay? So in this case, if I'm talking about EIDL or if I'm talking about PPP, that is all the SBA, okay?
Okay.
So you would go to the SBA Office of Inspector General website. They have their own website, SBA, I think, -OIG, and they
Okay.
have a hotline complaint form to fill out right on their website. In fact, I will share with you while we're on that subject, because I want to give you the stat because it's mind-boggling. Okay, you know that the two most frequent ways to find fraud. We know this statistically from the ACFE annual reports to the nation. The two most significant ways that fraud are found are either by accident or by tip. And they constantly change. Some years accidents first and tip is second, and then many years tip is first. So when we talk about these hotlines, these are best practices. The whole reason we've created these hotlines as fraud professionals is so that you can make the anonymous call. But if you don't want to make it anonymous and you're willing to leave your information, they can get back to you and follow up on the information. So
Right.
you would use the hotline. And with the SBA in particular, to give you these stats, they have special agents and hotline operators and investigators who are answering the hotline 24 hours a day. However, they have been so overwhelmed with reports that they have had to turn the hotline off for a good reason, and they've turned it off and made it exclusively online reporting. And
Okay.
the reason that they're using online reporting is because it then feeds right into the SBA's database where they can immediately pull the EIDL or PPP loan that's associated with that person's name. So from a workflow perspective, it was easier for them to stop answering calls because all that was happening is the special agent was having to manually enter it into the complaint form so they could then go look for the loan. So it's all online now, but I want to share these stats with you. Last year, the SBA Office of Inspector General had approximately 800 hotline tips. Okay.
What about this year?
Yeah. This year, to date, they have received 42,000 tips. So they have had a 10,000% increase in the tips that they've had. But they have not, this goes without saying, but I'm saying it because I want to drive home the point. If anybody that's listening thinks they've had a 10,000% increase in their budget to hire new investigators or auditors, you'd be mistaken. But even if they had gotten it, anybody who knows how the federal personnel system works would know that it takes a long time to grow and nurture a baby special agent. Special agents are not Acme, they're not coming out a Roadrunner where you can just pour some water on them. They take time before you can hire them and train them. In fact, looking at my school's program, it's a 4-year program to get a degree in accounting with a certificate in fraud and forensics. So 10,000% increase, but they're making actionable steps. So to our listener who's out there who's asking, if they can figure out what the program fraud is, they should go to that inspector general. If they can't, then the fallback would be filing it with the Federal Trade Commission, which is what we were talking about. And the FTC will try to figure out what agency it goes to and shotgun it to that agency.
Okay. All right, cool. That's good information. Moving along with COVID relief fraud types, what did we get to?
All right. So next, I just want to talk about the next type of fraud. I'm lumping it as Medicaid, Medicare, and health insurance fraud.
Okay.
Okay. We don't have the full numbers of how large the fraud is yet, but it's clearly in the hundreds of millions, if not larger. So in its most benign form of fraud, I know that sounds crazy to put it like that, but in the most benign form of fraud, they are soliciting new patients to do COVID testing, and they're actually doing the tests. However, they may be overbilling for the tests. That would be the most, benign. But the next most benign would be that they offer the tests for free, but the only way you can get the test for free is if you agree to take their assessment. And the assessment will then order a whole battery of other tests, which are then being billed either to Medicare, Medicaid, or to your own health insurance.
And they're not necessary.
So, and they're completely unnecessary. So that is just classic healthcare fraud. Okay. So these are anti-kickback type. They're basically, you're frustrated because you try to go to a CVS or Walgreens and you're now being told that you got to wait 4.5 hours in line and nobody's social distancing. And it's the very situation you don't want to be in to begin with. And then even when you get to the front of the line where they're telling you it's 3 days to get a result, and now it's been 3 weeks and you still don't have a result. So now you have these guys offering the free tests. And in a lot of the cases, they're not just offering the free test to you. They're going to homeowners associations. They're going to senior living facilities that may have hundreds of seniors that are at risk. And they're saying, hey, we can get all the tests done today. But if we get them done, we want this assessment to be done. And the assessment may involve a cardio battery, may involve, a CBC for just blood work to be done. And the whole purpose is they're trying to run up the bill because now they've got a captive audience. That's the benign. The more malicious is the test is bullshit and it's a fake test, that it's getting billed out to insurance, but they're not actually getting a legitimate result. So we're getting a type 1 or a type 2 error, meaning they could be telling you you're positive and you're not, or they could be telling you you're negative and you're not, and you're walking around infecting other people, and your health insurance is being billed for it.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, now let's get to the fraud squared. Okay? The fraud squared is, I think, using the health insurance, the most malignant of all. Okay? What type of information, when you're a new patient, Hal, do you have to give when you go to a lab or when you go to a new doctor?
Everything.
Because they need to bill your insurance, right?
Yeah.
And if insurance comes back to you, they need to be able to document that it was you who was there. So
they're getting date of birth, social security number, insurance numbers, they're getting the whole meal.
Right. And I'm just telling you, as a new faculty member out here on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake, I've had to switch my providers. Have you ever had to give your driver's license, and do they scan it into the file now?
Yeah.
Okay. So imagine the scam within a scam is maybe they're giving you a real test, but they now have all your digits. Okay. So the scam within a scam is maybe it's a legitimate test, or most likely it's not a legitimate test. And now they're applying for PPP or EIDL loans in your name.
Right.
Okay. So you are being double or maybe triple victimized. So some of these scammers are going into HOA communities. I'm just going to use Maryland because Maryland is a huge HOA community where in many cases we have a lot of unincorporated, where an entire county won't have a lot of municipalities.
Sure.
And the municipality is really the HOA. So if they go into an HOA with 5,000 or 10,000 residents and they can get a management company to hire them as a contractor, you could have identity theft literally on an industrial scale where 5,000 or 10,000 people in an entire community are now having SBA loans applied for in their name, and the testing's useless.
It's devious. It's just absolutely devious. And, people like you and me, and I'm assuming most of the folks in the webinar, we just don't think this way, but you have to be able to think about how other people think this way in order to kind of address these things.
And it brings us back to the fraud triangle, because the whole point is they're thinking about it because how do I get the Lambo?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. How do I pay for my new boat? How do I pay for my stripper girlfriend?
Yeah. Yeah. Or your stripper girlfriend.
Stripper girlfriends are expensive.
Your stripper girlfriend on the new boat.
Stripper girlfriend on the new boat. And that's expensive.
It is. It is indeed. We got about 6 minutes left before we got to stop this thing. So let's talk real quick about some opportunities for investigators to get involved with investigating the above. The stuff that how can boots on the ground private investigators get involved in this kind of work?
Okay, so I'm going to tell you that this is such a wide open opportunity for professional investigators that it's not funny. This is a way where we can take lemons and we can try to make lemonade using our professional skill set. Many investigators, but not all, have heard of this law. It's called the False Claims Act. Okay, so under the False Claims Act, this is a federal law that Congress created during the Civil War because profiteers were taking advantage of the U.S. government when it had to build and equip an entire military during the Civil War. And boots, muskets, canned meat that was going to the soldiers was, of course, spoiled. And we didn't have the resources to fight the war to begin with, let alone the fraud. So the False Claims Act says that a relator, so a relator is the whistleblower, somebody who comes forward, that the relator can file a federal lawsuit under seal in federal court, civil lawsuit, not criminal, and it is then given to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice has 90 days to decide whether to intervene or not intervene. And in a perfect world, they intervene because then you don't have to do anything. But if they don't intervene, then the relator's lawyers stand in the shoes of the Attorney General, including getting to sign documents and issue subpoenas in the name of the United States government, and can conduct the investigation on behalf of the government. Okay? And at the end of the day, the way the False Claims Act works is it provides for treble damages against the alleged fraudster.
Sure.
Okay. And the relator gets somewhere between 10 and 30% of the total bounty received plus attorney's fees.
Okay.
So the answer for the private investigator who wants to get involved, or the fraud investigator, is that if they have an example or a case or multiple cases or a doctor's office or fraudsters on the internet or a bank that's not implementing the appropriate internal controls where the employees are getting the money and not small businesses, they can approach a whistleblower law firm with the case on a platter, and the investigator can be the relator.
Ah.
Okay. So an example, you and I spoke about this offline, but I just want our audience to know the most recent example of this being a success. We've all seen in the newspapers that recently a number of pharmaceutical companies have settled for billions of dollars with the US government and with state attorneys general for writing all these opioid prescriptions inappropriately and hooking all these people on drugs. The relators and the people who did the work in many cases were the investigation firms.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so without getting into the name of the firm or who this person is, I will share with you that somebody that is well known both to Hal and to me owned the firm that had the contract work, who went and met with all the drug reps. So they were basically deputized state attorney general investigators, but they were PIs with PI licenses. And they went and got the drug reps on tape or in sworn statements to admit that they were pressuring the doctors to write the drugs in inappropriate circumstances. And it was that evidence obtained by the investigators that allowed these multi-billion-dollar settlements. Now, obviously, I am a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer, and we're not giving legal advice. So whether you as a private investigation firm can share in a contingent award, I think is going to be based state by state on what your Department of Criminal Justice Services or state police say for the license in your state. But even if you can't share in the bounty, that doesn't mean the law firm that can, right, that gets the contingent fee, that doesn't mean they can't hire your firm to do the work and just pay you on an hourly basis. But I suspect that in certain states, which you have to consult somebody in your state, I suspect the private investigators can share in the bounty.
And I mean, if you're ethically bound, I mean, yeah, I'm just thinking through this. And again, guys, this is certainly not legal advice, but if you're ethically bound as a licensed private investigator, not to work on contingency fees, if you come across a case like this that you think is worthwhile, it actually might make sense to surrender your PI license and just become a normal citizen and be the relator at that point. I don't know if that works.
And I have to defer to, I'm assuming if you don't have it, you don't have it. But then it's still, I don't want to overcomplicate things, but from a lawyer perspective, most of the states I'm licensed in, the lawyer can't share the attorney's fee with a non-lawyer. But if you're the relator, you're not sharing the fee, you're getting the bounty as the relator. So I think it could work. And so I want to give a suggestion for those people who are listening. Again, I think this is somebody Hal knows too, but if not, he will now. one of my closest friends, who is a former cop like me, runs a whistleblower firm now, and his name is Brian Mahaney. And I'm going to suggest his name. Okay. So, and I'm going to give his phone number. Are you okay if I give a phone number on the air?
I'm totally fine with that.
Okay. I'm going to give a phone number because he set the phone number up just for COVID. Okay. And that phone number is 929-290-1266. I'll read it once more. 929-290-1266. Just a brief plug on who Brian is, because he's a man. I mean, the reason we're friends is because our background is like identical. He started his career as a New Orleans cop before he went to law school. And for those of you who know, New Orleans is a bad place to be a cop. And it's a tough place to be a cop. And it's an even tougher place to be an honest cop. And just like me, I mean, I went to law school after becoming a Fed. And so we've always gotten along because we're kind of like that. So he, until recently, had the largest bounty that's ever been given to a client, ever. So all of you know him. You just don't know his name. He was the whistleblower lawyer in the Bank of America settlement for the collateralized debt obligations from our last crisis. And he received a huge bounty from the United States government on behalf of his client. His client was a Bank of America loan officer who revealed that they were falsely certifying the stuff inside the bank.
Right.
So that's why I want to mention him to you and that phone number. But if you just Google him, if you just Google Brian Mahaney, his website will come up. So now I can't say he's number one anymore because there's been an even bigger one, but he's number two. And his client got like
a lot of money,
over $100 million.
Wow. Wow.
And that was somebody who raised their hand and did the right thing, but it was the False Claims Act that was used. So all of us have the skill set, either because people are talking to us or because we figure it out ourselves, where we could be the relator or we could be working for relator counsel and be getting paid, which is what happened in the pharma case. In the pharma case, the firms were making an hourly rate. They didn't share in the bounty, but I believe they made millions of dollars in fees by doing the footwork. And it comes full circle because here we are at the end, by getting off your ass and knocking on doors.
And that's it. That's it, people. At the end of the day, we're investigators. We get out and we knock on doors. We talk to people. We draw connections. We identify things like that. That's what we do. And there's no reason not to figure out a way to kind of insert yourself in some of these cases. And I'm glad we got to talk about the whistleblower stuff because my good friend Joe Cabreos out in Hawaii was asking about the whistleblower role in fraud cases and how the whistleblower can benefit from those kind of things. So that answered that. David, we are just past a full hour on here. So
I'm sorry I held you guys up, man. I could talk all day. I mean,
I know, I could too. So let's do this. We're going to give a discount code for PI Education. It is Fraud 2020, or I'm sorry, Fraud 20, Fraud 20. It'll get you 10% off of any course you want between now and the end of the month. David Weber, Clinical Assistant Professor of Accounting at Purdue School of Business at Salisbury University. Thank you so much for being here. I've really enjoyed the chat.
I told Hal, and for all you people out there, this is the first damn time I've worn a tie in months. I did this just for you, only for you, not even for Hal.
I love it. Have a good weekend, everybody.